Hello, everyone. Welcome to episode 11 of the Exodus seminar. Today, we're going to talk about the differentiation of the law. The last couple of days, we've walked through the 10 Commandments, and it's reasonable to think of those as the minimal preconditions, the minimal fundamental preconditions for both psychological unity as well as security and hope, and the establishment of a stable polity that can play itself out in an iterable manner across reasonable stretches of time, incorporating many people. Preconditions for unity, the axiomatic preconditions for unity, that's a reasonable way of thinking about it. What happens in the text now is that those fundamental presuppositions are differentiated into the more particular codes of conduct that are necessary to govern a society, and then also differentiate themselves into the rituals and aesthetic of worship. And in keeping with that, we'll cover two main topics today, running through Exodus 21 to 24, with any luck, description of the expanded law, and then the place and aesthetic of worship. And so that's today's plan. We're not going to go through the text in its entirety because it's very detailed, and because we want to incorporate some of the narrative of the broader Exodus story that's not technically in the book of Exodus into this seminar. And so we will take excerpts and use some images today to augment our discussion without falling prey to the detail that would be otherwise necessary. So we'll start with Exodus 21, beginning the exposition of the law in detail in excerpts. So Exodus 21:2, if thou buy a Hebrew servant, 6 years shall he serve, and in the 7th he shall go out free for nothing. So that's obviously a commentary on the limitation of something like indentured servitude. Perhaps we could call it slavery. And so there's a freedom that's extended to the slave who would have been indentured in one manner or another. I'm going to go through the laws here, and anyone who wants to chime in and comment.
Well, just for this one, it's important because it's related to the Sabbath. It's like an implication of the Sabbath, which is that if you take a servant, if someone becomes your property, for 6 years they will work, and then the 7th year they are set free. And so it's just a structure that you find in the Sabbath, also in the Jubilee, the different structures of how we kind of restore things so that we wouldn't have generations of Hebrew slaves bound to one family forever, and so you would create this destructuring thing within the people.
But it imitates the rhythm of creation.
That's right.
That's the point.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And it's
a magnificent contrast to the other nations, who all have classes
that are permanent.
Now, here, no permanent slaves and no unequal permanent classes.
Right. We should make a point here that the natural condition of human society is class distinction that are relatively permanent as the upper classes can make them, we might say, and slave ownership. And so that any movement in the direction of the freeing of the slaves is a revolutionary movement. But having said that, how do you reconcile the fact that God is the spirit that leads people out of tyranny in the broader book of Exodus, but there's still allowance made, for example, in this verse, for the existence of slavery per se?
Yeah. Well, the thing about slavery is that it's very difficult for us to understand what ancient slavery was, because we have safety nets, we have all these things which make it possible for people to exist. But in a world where you have someone who can become in such a dire situation that they're basically, dying of hunger in the street, selling yourself or placing yourself under the authority of someone else was a way in which to continue this, to actually preserve the social fabric. And so it's like, I can't do it. I just can't. I'm not. So I propose myself to someone. I say, I want to enter into your service. You take care of me. I work for you. And then after 6 years, then hopefully I'm set on a path that I can now continue.
It's like a mortgage on yourself. And
as you pointed out, it is indentured servitude. And I don't know the statistic. I wish I did by heart. But more than half of the earliest settlers of America came as indentured servants. So that's how common it is. It was a way actually of uplifting your life, as you both have pointed out. And the other thing worth noting is the word for slave in Hebrew, eved, is very complex because does it mean servant, does it mean slave? For example, Moses is described as Eved Adonai, the Eved of God. Is he God's slave? Nobody thought so. Yet the Jews or the Hebrews, Israelites in Egypt are avadim, plural of Eved. So they were slaves. So the Torah, I guess almost unfortunately, uses the same word for servant as for slave.
Well, one of the things we need to understand about words in general is that as they move through time, they become more specific. So if you chase a word back in time, it has a broader and broader and broader and broader range of application. It contains more concepts that would be differentiated in modern society. So it's harder for us to understand what the word might mean.
But you remember earlier in Exodus, you free them that they might serve the Lord.
Yeah,
in other words, the
right.
principle is, Bob Dylan, you've got to serve somebody.
Right. So there's,
But this service, we have a prayer in the Anglican service book, your service is perfect freedom. And that's Moses, the servant of the Lord.
Oh, I should point out, too, that we're welcoming Douglas Headley to the table today. He hasn't been here for the last 2 episodes, but he's come today and should be sitting in for the rest of the seminar. So welcome, Douglas. We're extremely happy to have you back with us. So, okay, I'd like to point out that we've got through one whole law so far. And so we'll go to 21.3. Which is an extension of the same proposition. So this is a limitation on indentured servitude. If he came in by himself, he shall go out by himself. If he were married, then his wife shall go out with him. If his master have given him a wife, and she have borne him sons or daughters, the wife and her children shall be her master's, and he shall go out by himself. So that enables him to take with him what he has accrued to himself, I presume. And if the servant shall plainly say, I love my master, my wife, and my children, I will not go out free, then his master shall bring him unto the judges. He shall also bring him to the door or unto the doorpost.
Okay, forgive me. So this is critical. There is an obvious implication that not everybody will pick up on. If the slave says, I love my master, so people will think, what kind of kook is that? A slave who loves his master. But it's not a master in the sense that we think of like the transatlantic slave trade or ill treatment in South America, etc. This is again what we said earlier, indentured servitude, and it is possible he loved his master. What if he treated him well? And he has his needs taken care of, and he doesn't want to leave his wife and children. So it implies, if nothing else, the possibility that there were good people or decent people in the role of quote-unquote master.
And this enables the person to continue that service, even though in some manner he's condemned to be free by the Sabbath lifting of the indentured servitude requirement.
But there is a subtlety here that if he comes in with his wife, he goes free with his wife in the 7th year. But if the master gives him his wife and he bears children, the wife and children stay.
Right.
So this is whatever we may think of that.
Property differentiation.
Yes, this is a way of his being able to freely stay with what he has been part of building. But it doesn't simply go with him because of this distinction in the law between whether you were given it or whether you brought it with you.
Right. It's difficult when you're explicating a text as ancient as this to understand exactly what parts you would require to be permanently applicable and what parts have to be differentiated so they were laws that were germane and relevant to a time and place. And so it's very difficult for modern people to understand anything like the morality of this set of rules because all of the conditions under which these rules were generated are so different from our conditions. But it's also hard, I guess, for people who are claiming something like the divinity of the biblical text to also say, well, this doesn't apply because it only applied to that time and place. And so,
but what the text, I mean, first of all, there's a huge distinction that might be good to make now. This God is everybody's God. First one to say so. And he gives a law in great detail. We're going through it. It's not everybody's law. It's the Jewish law, right? And Christians think that later God will say, my kingdom is not of this world. And that means he doesn't give us laws like this. And that's an enormous change. And see, if in Islam, God is a universal God and a lawgiver. And that means the one who interprets the law has got supreme authority. It's hard to think what check there is on it. But in both Judaism and Christianity, it isn't like that. These laws are as strict and detailed as any in the ancient world, but they're just for this people. And there's a structure, by the way, of rule. This is a polity. We're founding a polity here, right? And they can be analyzed against each other according to Aristotle's categories for one. And this polity has a structure of authority that it's not absolute monarchy. It's in the beginning, it's hardly monarchy at all. And there's priests and rulers, and they offset each other. And this law is a law over them too. And so it's a very curious thing, and it gives fuel and credence to the Christian view that this is a preparation for God to rule all the earth.
That's right. We can see in the particularity of the laws the seeds of a universal understanding of all humanity. Because what's different from the codes that came before is that we don't have it's not just an abolition of distinctions among classes. It's very clear that there is no longer any category of human being that is, as it were, enslaved. That servitude is sort of part of what it is to be that category of human being. And so we should see it really, I think, in developmental terms. We're seeing what we need to do is compare with what went before, and we need to understand the kind of trajectory of the moral universe of Israel towards the universalism that we find later on.
There's a phenomenon that Egyptologists described as the democratization of Osiris and Horus. And so the pharaoh in Egypt was conceptualized as the union of Osiris and Horus. So Osiris was the god of the state who could become willfully blind to the machinations of evil, who was once great in his youth, but who developed this ossification across time. That's the problem of tradition. And then Horus is the visionary revitalizer who journeys to the underworld and revitalizes the father. And the Egyptians conceptualized the pharaoh, the sovereignty of the pharaoh, as the union of Osiris and Osiris. So it's the union of tradition and vision. And then to begin with, only the pharaoh could use the symbolism that was associated with Osiris and Horus, but then the aristocracy began to pick it up. And they call that the democratization of Osiris. And you can think of what happened among the Jews as an extension of that. It's a spreading down of the idea of sovereignty and intrinsic value itself down to the hoi polloi, you might say.
I think there's a parallel to this. If I'm not mistaken, in Babylonian political theology, the phrase image of God or something very like it was confined to the king, the Babylonian king. It looks as if what may be happening in the early chapters of Genesis is that you've got a similar process of democratization as the image of God shifts from king to all human beings.
And that's, again, that parallels also the abstraction of the idea of sovereignty. So sovereignty is no longer what a king does. It's in the nature of the king. And then once you understand to some degree that it's in the nature of the king, then you can think, well, maybe that kingly nature is distributed more widely than you might have assumed to begin with, and then maybe eventually it's part and parcel of everyone.
All earthly sovereignty is relative sovereignty, and then it's, as it were, distributed sovereignty.
And the principle of sovereignty is equivalent between every individual. There's something in you that's sovereign. There's something in me that's sovereign. Our proper relationship is one of sovereign to sovereign, and with that you also start to ground the idea of the sovereignty of the people, the true sovereignty of the people, and the idea that the leader is now someone, this eventually happens, is now someone who serves that distributed sovereignty in the people and is subordinate to that.
So we see here really a revolution in the history of moral thought.
Absolutely. Yeah, well, go ahead.
No, go ahead. Finish.
Well, modern people, they think often, well, we don't believe these things anymore. And I think, well, you act it out. So it's not so obvious you don't believe it. You don't want to be around someone who doesn't treat you or the people you love as if they're sovereign individuals with no free will, with no intrinsic dignity. None of your relationships are going to work, and they're certainly not going to be desirable unless they're predicated on that principle. So the idea that you don't believe it simply isn't true. And if there isn't something that's under that belief, which is a recognition of the transcendent dignity of the individual, then you think, well, that belief in you is weak, right? It's got no foundation. On what grounds do you posit that? And that makes it vulnerable to disruption. So,
But a lot of people could hear what you're both saying and interpret it in an evolutionary framework, that we have a slow evolution of religion, and the Jews are rising a little higher than the Babylonians and the Egyptians. I think that's wrong. I think this is genuinely revolutionary because of revelation, as we were talking yesterday. So you've got this double contrast. Egypt behind you, monarchy, hierarchy, tyranny, slavery. And here's a covenantal way of doing things. Michael Walzer calls it an almost democracy. All the people buy in, and it applies to all the people. And there's no classes here.
There's still servitude
class.
there.
There's a priestly class.
Well,
there's still a caste. It's just not. There's at least two castes. There's a priestly caste.
And they are?
There is a priestly caste in
so that's
Israel.
interesting. I'm not even challenging. I'm very curious. You think that in the eyes of the Israelite, the priest was like the Brahmin in Hinduism? That was the upper class?
I don't know if it was the upper class, but it was a distinct hereditary class.
Correct.
Yeah.
But okay, so hereditary and caste are co-equal or synonymous?
It's just a separation of function within society.
Okay.
Clear separation.
Right, a separation of function without separation of value?
Right, that's the key.
possible.
That's my
Right.
question.
Right, well, that might distinguish a caste from
they
a
are
function.
of equal value. No,
But differentiated.
Jews never thought that the priest was more valuable than the Levite or the Israelite. Just, I think that's important. But they had a distinctive role.
Just quickly back to Oz's point. I mean, it's not democracy in the sense that we don't here have full equality. There's still
almost democracy.
Almost
It's
democracy.
also.
There's still servitude. There's still a sense in which the indentured servant doesn't have really any participation in public life or in public decision making.
But he sold himself.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So
only
there's
for those
or
6
was
years,
sold
and
by
then he's
his
out.
it's given a moral rationale.
Well, captors in war, too.
That's the non-Jewish.
Well, there's
and
also
that's only in war.
There's also very little discussion of anything that we would really describe as politics here yet, right? So, and Oz, you made this comment about this evolutionary approach. Let's say, well, I do see in other societies at the time, and in other societies in different time and place, that there is a striving towards a realization of ideas that are similar. So you see in Mesopotamia, for example, the god Marduk, who was the model for the sovereignty of the emperor, had eyes that encircled his head. So he was like the Egyptian god Horus in that sense, the god of attention, I think, really, the god of careful attention, but also spoke words of magic. And that is a concept, and that was central to what sovereignty was, that capacity to speak compelling words of magic. There's an idea there that's very much like the idea of the divine word that's kind of in some way struggling to be born among the Mesopotamians. And I think it's relevant to our discussion yesterday that there might be a yearning upward from the material world to join with the dispensation downward of the revelation. And
So long as we're always saying both and.
absolutely,
case.
absolutely.
That point, your point about the political, Jordan, this is very interesting. It's actually, it isn't political. That is to say, the servitude is understood as something that belongs to the household. It's not something that involves a relation of the wrongdoer and a central state, as it were.
Well, I think we're also just seeing here the struggling towards something that we would even recognize as political. We're not at that point of differentiation yet in the place of cultural evolution.
Well, the Jews are always murmuring, right? And, building political parties and stuff, and let them get killed for it here and there. But so politics is coeval with the human condition. The question is, what form does it take? And what we're seeing the birth of is a form for it. And the form both concentrates and distributes power. and that means it's constitutional in a way. And you know, I don't know if I differ from ours, but not all monarchy is tyranny. Tyranny is the bad form of monarchy.
No, we're saying Egypt was tyranny.
Egypt is a society questing for immortality by their own devices. And that is a despotic enterprise.
Mm-hmm. Well, even the Egyptians themselves, I think, understood that under optimal conditions, it's tricky in Egypt. In Mesopotamia, from my understanding, there was a real separation between the emperor and Marduk. So the emperor was seen as an avatar of Marduk, whereas in Egypt, the identity was closer. The pharaoh was Osiris and Horus. But that becomes ambiguous as the Egyptian dynasties progress, and I think people develop a more sophisticated conceptualization of what sovereignty might mean. So, all right, so 21:6.
Oh, forgive me.
Oh, go ahead, Dennis.
I just want to, this is way back, a good 10 minutes ago, you mentioned something, and I just have to state, I do believe in the divinity of the 5 books of the Torah, and divinity and permanence of a law are not identical. It could be a divinely given law, and yet I just quickly want to give one example that is not in Exodus, which strikes most readers as bizarre, and I think it is brilliant. If a man suspects his wife of adultery, he brings him to the priest, who gives her a potion, and if her belly swells, she's guilty. And if it doesn't swell, she's innocent, and they go back to one another. His suspicions are assuaged, and hopefully they will reconcile and have a good marriage. It is obviously, we don't do this today. They stopped doing this by the time of Jesus.
Lost the formula for that potion.
Right, we don't know. What is clear to me is this was God's way of getting husbands not to be suspicious of their wives. It was a way to keep the couple together. I don't believe any woman's belly ever blew up when this potion was given, but it was a genius way. Remember, this is late Bronze Age. What is divine? Keeping the couple together, assuaging the husband's suspicions, keeping his dignity because now she's shown to be innocent, and the fact that God wants couples to stay together. Why is that not divine?
We also have in the story of Noah the insistence that Noah is a man who's wise in his generations. And so there's some recognition in the biblical corpus that there are some elements of what constitutes, let's say, the details of what's moral that pertain to that time and place.
That's why I love the founders of America.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Okay, so 21:6, this is what happens to the servant who decides to stay. His master shall bring him unto the judges. He shall also bring him to the door or to the doorpost. And his master shall bore his ear through with an awl, and he shall serve him forever. So the law there is that if you hit the 7th year and you're freed and you decide to not take advantage, let's say, of that freedom, then you have consigned yourself to permanent service or allowed yourself to be protected.
And there's an echo of the earlier story of the blood on the doorposts. No, it's a kind of vote for freedom.
Mm-hmm. And I just think this is a very beautiful image relative to what you were saying earlier, because this is radical in the sense that it is making clear that a human being can be capable of making a permanent commitment to reciprocity. That there's a stability to the will, that our dignity has, in fact, to do with our ability to make promises and to fulfill them. And in an age in which, momentary commitments and betrayal of, quasi commitments, this is a radical revelation or instantiation, articulation of something that is absolutely fundamental to any vision of human dignity.
Well, we tend to think of those permanent commitments as an abdication of freedom. And I think one of the problems with that is that we do a bad job of distinguishing freedom from chaos, and we also don't understand that, and a corollary to that is that we don't understand that you can bind excess uncertainty with permanence of contractual relationship. I mean, one of the things that that permanently committing yourself to your wife does is solve the problem of mate choice. Now, you might not be, it's replaced by the problem of how do you keep the relationship happy and alive, but I think that's a lesser problem than which person do you pick out of the multitude of people that you might be able to pick, or the even worse problem that none of those people would pick you back.
Dennis,
and the more likely one.
Can I ask Dennis, what's going on there? This is a market with the piercing of the ear with an awl. This is...
Well, the rabbis had a very interesting view of that. Their view was the ear that heard that God wants you to be free, wants you to be free, and if you don't want to be free, you will be marked in that ear.
Okay.
All right, we'll skip to 21:12. He that smiteth a man so that he die shall be surely put to death. So that's the eye for an eye punishment, tooth for a tooth, let's say, a judgment on murder. And if a man lie not in wait, but God deliver him into his hand, then I will appoint thee a place whither shall he flee. But if a man come presumptuously upon his neighbor to slay him with guile, thou shalt take him from mine altar, that he may die. And he that smiteth his father or his mother shall surely be put to death.
So taken from the altar, this is a beautiful law. I love it. You cannot come into my altar if you're a murderer and claim refuge.
Mm-hmm.
Which would have been common.
Right.
That's right.
Elsewhere
Again,
in the ancient world, right?
Yeah, certainly in Greece
this is
too,
a total break with the world as it was. This is a revolutionary text.
No asylum for this.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Okay, and there's also an attempt here to distinguish between different forms of what might easily be aggregated together as murder. So in 21:12 you have the death, a death paid for by a death, but in 21:13 there seems to be an insistence that if it was accidental,
Like if you get into a bar fight or something, like emotion flares up, you kill someone, it's not the same.
Premeditation.
Yeah, it's not premeditated.
and the punishments therefore differ, and so that pertains to some degree to the discussion we had yesterday about intent, is that if the intent, I would say,
Right.
if the
If it was
intent
an
is
accident.
to kill.
Yeah, but it's interesting. You may think, well, I mean, it gives an example. A man has an axe and the handle falls off and kills somebody. Clearly a total accident. And yet he does go to a city of refuge. A, to protect him from the family
Right.
who wants to get vengeance.
Yes.
But it's not an ideal life to be in a city of refuge. You're away from the regular world, and you're there till the chief priest dies, by the way. And there is a belief, apparently, in the Torah, and we are free to disagree, that even pure negligence, nevertheless, the Torah takes homicide so seriously, and there are a dozen examples, and this is one of them. Even if you kill accidentally, you should have been more careful. I'm sorry. The way we treat people who are inebriated and then run over 5 people, and then they don't spend a day in prison because they were inebriated, or they spend 2 years in prison. This is not Torah way of looking at it.
But it still seems
you
as
killed
if
people because of your negligence. You shouldn't have drunk.
But it does still seem as if the punishments are calibrated to the degree of intent.
Yes. Oh, totally.
Right.
Do you think there's at least 2 ways of reading this? One is, I talked to a woman in Albania. I hope I was in Albania, where there are parts of the culture who fell into a cult of honor killing that's been going on for centuries. And so, to what degree, so the honor culture cult is, well, if you kill my brother, then my family has now a moral obligation to slay one of you in return, and generally the one of you in your family that's of highest value. And the problem with that, well, the advantage of that, I would say, is there's an element of justice and there's an element of the respite of revenge. But the disadvantage is, well, it never stops. It just gets completely out of hand. And that's happened in this section of Albania for hundreds of years. It actually happened among Catholics there, interestingly enough. But I'm wondering, too, if the sanctuary city isn't there also to protect the person?
Oh, I
who,
said that.
Yeah.
Yes.
Oh, okay.
Yes,
so
that's
it's there
right.
as well to protect the person from the
vengeance killing,
vengeance.
yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. And then 21:15. And he that smiteth his father or his mother shall be surely put to death. And that's an echo of what we described yesterday, I would say, of the necessity of honoring your mother and father. This is parceled out as a particularly serious crime. Right.
You're attacking the source of your own existence. You're kind of annihilating yourself when you're attacking your parents.
Well, and you're violating, according to our discussion yesterday, that principle of verticality, right? That if the honor,
hinge,
the
between
hinge,
the vertical and the horizontal. Yeah.
This is all of these, in some sense, are following from. They're ways of, let's call it, enforcing. They're the consequences of breaking the laws we looked at yesterday. So the commandments are not simply, it would be good if you did these things and so on. That's to leave them in a certain state of, I don't know, subjective attendance. Like,
And
it's
vagueness.
good. Yeah, vagueness. This is saying, no, these really are the rules that make the conditions of this community full stop. And therefore, there have to be consequences
Right.
to violating those.
Right.
And so these are detailed breakings down of, at least according to this law,
Right.
what the punishment for those things has
Yeah.
to do in order to honor the higher level,
Right. Well, we
commandments.
said yesterday that the simpler commandments were no murder. Well, the thing about no, I've thought for a long time, thinking through the philosophy of punishment, especially in relationship to children, what does no mean? And no, in the final analysis, means if you do that, something you do not like will certainly happen to you. If that isn't the promise behind your words when you say no, there's no promise there at all. And so your point is, well, if it's a prohibition, there has to be a limit, and the limit has to be detailed and understandable to everyone as well, and also proportionate. And that's what's attempting to be established here, right?
May I ask a psychologist a rather simple-minded question? Why do you think the force of this, he that smiteth his father, I mean, the Freudian resonance of that is will strike the modern mind. Now, clearly, Cain and Abel, sibling rivalry, and we've had a lot of that in the UK of late, that makes sense. Why is there such a difference between the eruption of antagonism between brothers, which is pretty normal in my experience and probably others, and this shift between that and
well, we
the
took this
father?
apart yesterday in a slightly different context, and the idea was that to orient yourself properly morally, two things have to happen at the same time. You have to orient yourself properly with regards to that which is transcendent, so that might be the moral order that extends across time, that's universal. And you have to orient yourself in relationship to your community. And the commandments seem to be structured according to that differentiation model. Vertical orientation up Jacob's ladder, and horizontal in relationship to other people. Somebody commented that you see that echoed in the Sermon on the Mount when Christ says you have to love God and your fellow man. And so it's the honoring of the father and the mother that seem to be the place where those two things unite. I mean, one of the things that's disturbed me about our modern society is that people complain about the tyranny and brutality of the past in a manner that's entirely ungrateful. And you have this responsibility to honor tradition. And I think that the manner in which tradition manifests itself that's most local to you is in the form of your father and your mother. And so if you strike them, it's not only that you're striking another person, smiting another person, but that you're violating the principle of something like respect, honor for tradition itself. And then you're violating that vertical principle.
And there's an interesting aspect to this, I think, in what Goethe says, when he says that a child needs roots and wings, and that the parent gives the child stability so that the child can obviously leave and be free. And it seems to me that there's a very interesting relation to that thought and to our lack of a sense of tradition in contemporary culture, and the failure to recognize that re-inhabiting tradition, which we have to do, given our nature, is a creative act.
It's also a courageous act in some sense that you're called upon morally to honor the tradition. And that begs the question, well, why? And the question might be begged, for example, when people are called upon to feel guilty for the excesses of the British Empire, for any empire for that matter, is that we bear the mark of the brutality of history, and of that there can be little doubt. So what's your proper response and orientation to that? And the answer still seems to be something like, it's incumbent upon you to honor your tradition. And then I think you have to go about figuring out how you do that. I think what we were supposed to be doing in the universities was guiding people through that process, helping them separate the wheat from the chaff, and saying something like, well, here's what we take from the past that's of tremendous value, part of the golden thread of conversation. So one good example of that might be, well, do we decry the establishment of the United States because slavery was still rampant when that state was established, or do we carefully note that at the time the American state was established, that a spirit that called for universal emancipation was making itself manifest, and that the spirit that oriented the America that's most proper, and say the American relationship to the UK, was actually that spirit that was calling for universal emancipation? We can say, well, there were proclivities that were pulling us back into the temptations of enslavement, but the fundamental spirit was one of emergent emancipation and universality of the principles of human dignity. And then if you're an educator, you help people sort that out and extract out what's valuable. And I think that's the same thing as honoring your I mean, one of the things I found so exciting about university was that I was able to find a group of meta peers. Right? I mean, new friends, and that was wonderful. You know, it was a renewal in that. But by delving into the great books of the past, I could acquaint myself with people like Friedrich Nietzsche and Dostoevsky and far more ancient thinkers than that, and pull out what was so valuable about their contributions, while still saying, well, not everything that was applicable in the past is applicable in the present. And I think that is part of that, honoring your father and your mother in a metaphysical and philosophical sense. So,
a word about the death penalty. There are many such death penalties in the Torah, the first 5 books. And I won't take the time. I will only say that I am convinced that they were always put there as a deterrence, with the one exception of murder. And the reason I believe murder is the one exception where the death penalty was meant literally and not as a simply statement of how severe the sin is regarded in God's eyes, is that it is the only law in all 5 books of the Torah, in Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, that you will take the life of a murderer. Secondly, it is one of the only laws God himself gives in Genesis. Genesis has almost no laws. One of them, in the very beginning of the creation of the world, is that if a human being takes the life of another, his life shall be taken by humans, because in God's image, humans were created. So again, we have no example in Jewish history of a child being put to death because he hit his parent. But it is in there for, as again, I believe, God's wanting to communicate how severe that act is in God's eyes.
The command you say about murder is stronger or different in some way than the command about a child hitting a parent?
Yes. There's no, or any of the other, or there are many examples of adultery, or male homosexual relations. There are many examples where the death penalty is offered, but we have no record of somebody actually being put to death for it. It is there to say this is a serious sin. Why the homosexuality obviously is worthy of. I wrote a 22,000-word essay on that verse. It will come out in my Leviticus commentary, if I may offer that as a thought. But most important, again, it is the only law in all 5 books, and it is the only one that God himself gives, the only death penalty in creating the world.
Yeah. And I think what happens is, I understand, some people get completely turned off when they read
That's right.
the law, because all they see is all these people being
Death
killed.
penalties, that's right.
And then they stop thinking about
That's right.
what the laws are about and
That's
what it
why
is
I
they're
said
trying
it.
to set
Thank
up.
you. That is why I wanted it to be noted.
Yeah.
It is not meant to be enacted. It is meant. What was the Torah going to say? If you hit your parent, there's a 100 shekel fine. I mean, think about it. How does God communicate how serious the parent should be taken? You go to jail for a week? I mean, they didn't have jails.
That's
I mean,
right. There's also a situation that they lived in a world where everything was so precarious that if someone fell out of the bounds, there was nothing to do with them. You can't have a
mechanism for incarceration.
Exactly. Yes.
Yeah.
Right.
Right.
So 21:17, it's an extension of the same line of thought with regards to honoring tradition. And he that curseth his father or his mother shall surely be put to death. More variation.
All right, you will love this one, I promise.
If men strive...
Forgive me, I want to do one on the insult. Hebrew insult comes from the root kal, which means light, as in non-heavy. And the word to honor comes from the word kaved, which means heavy. To take your parent, so in other words, taking your parent lightly is the literal translation of curse, and taking your parent heavily is the literal translation of honor.
Oh, that's interesting, because heavy implies something that's deep and profound, right, and in the depths. And so the notion there is that if you take your parents lightly, that you don't build your foundation on the foundation of tradition, and then you'll be light, and then you'll blow away during a storm. So
Yeah, beautiful.
if men strive and hurt a woman with child, so that her fruit depart from her, and yet no mischief follow, he shall be surely punished, according as the woman's husband will lay upon him, and he shall pay as the judges determine. Dennis, you discussed including this particular verse, so I'm going to turn that over to you.
Well, very quickly, this is uniquely, no, I don't know if uniquely, but it is a particularly difficult one, because it's an odd law. If 2 men are fighting and by accident, one of them strikes a woman who is pregnant and her children depart from her, then the following happens. It's not exactly an everyday situation. It must have been a specific moment and what the adjudication was. And there is no great clarity here, because it is not clear when it says in the Hebrew, and there be, what is the word that you use, mischief? What is the term?
And yet no mischief follow.
Right, okay, so the Hebrew means damage, generally speaking. Mischief, damage, there are many translations.
That means the woman is unharmed, I would say,
okay, no, that we don't know. Is it her or is it the children?
Right, the children, like that she gives birth to the child, let's say.
Well, the children come out, right? So if they are not injured severely or even killed, then you pay what the judge says you pay. And the people who are pro-choice have one take, and people who are pro-life have another. But we have to be intellectually honest. We don't know which it refers to. Is it the woman or the children? That no further damage takes place, or further damage does take place, to be precise. That's all I really wanted to note. That there is not much to be read into this in the pro-life, pro-choice debate, except to say that if you believe the damage is to the children, then clearly that is a statement about the worth of the human fetus. If you say it's only to the parent, then it has no statement about the worth of the fetus, but we don't know whom it is talking about. That's all. That's really important, I think, to note. And by the way, it comes from someone who does believe that the human fetus has worth. We have to first tell the truth. We can't read Scripture in the light of how we want it to sound. That's what I guess, the more important point.
What's interesting is that many jurisdictions recognize the worth of the fetus when it comes to double homicides.
That's right.
But not when it comes to their own, the same jurisdiction's abortion laws. It's a strange paradox.
Yeah, which I've never understood. But okay.
Well, it seems to be a reflection of the same underlying complexity that's tangled up in that verse.
But one thing is clear about the whole burden of this, the whole book of Exodus, is that the family and the process of reproduction and raising children is fundamental to the well-being of the community, and it's protected by huge barriers.
Yeah, and we'll return to that very shortly as we get into chapter 22. 21 continues. This is a very famous line. Everyone knows this virtually. And this is often pointed to by those who are skeptical about the integrity of the biblical text as an indication of the brutality of these archaic societies, but it was actually a limit on violence rather than the reverse. And we don't understand how violent these societies could be. Eye for eye, this is 21:24, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot. 21:25 is burning for burning, wound for wound, stripe for stripe. An idea here is that the reprisal for mischief and damage should be proportionate, because it could be, well, you trip me and I kill you. And that seems disproportionate. But in societies that were run by an honor code, disproportionate retaliation was the norm, and that rapidly, frequently cycled out of control. And this is a limit on that. You're not entitled to more damage than has been visited upon you.
Is this specifically unpacking the previous law,
Right,
Dennis?
but it happens.
Or does it distill
but
the
it also
whole
has it
logic
generally.
of proportionality?
It's not the only time that it's mentioned. You're entirely right, but it is not the only time eye for an eye is mentioned. So everything you said is critical. This was a major moral achievement, that an eye is only worth an eye, not a life or not two eyes. Also, the eye of a poor man is no less valuable than the eye of a nobleman or a king. This was a massive statement forward in history. And third, there is no example in the history of the Jewish people of somebody's eye being taken out if he took out somebody else's eye. It was always understood, except for the life part, it was always understood as monetary compensation. It is a statement of principle, however, that an eye is only worth an eye.
Right, so this is a limit, and it's not an injunction to vengeance, it's a limit.
Right.
Okay,
and restricts the punishment to the individual, not the individual's family and
Right,
tribe.
right.
And so
And
on.
limitation in that regard, too.
It contains the retribution.
And what do you make of the Christ statement, which he says if
I've heard it said.
yeah, that if it's an eye for an eye, then we all end up blind and toothless. And so how does forgiveness, in terms of the way the Christian take on this, like how does it play in this?
You're going to open that can of worms at the moment.
Well, we don't
you?
have to. We don't have to.
That was it, the line of Gandhi's biographer, or he reports Gandhi as saying that an eye for an eye leaves the whole world blind.
Yeah.
But I think that was just, according to Dennis, would simply be a mistaken, overly literalistic way of
Well,
understanding
a
the principle of proportionality.
A family for an eye leaves everyone dead, and
Right.
society in tatters. An eye for an eye might leave everyone blind. But I would say, in answer to your question, it might be something like, well, imagine you were very sophisticated about being assaulted. You might say, well, is there any way that I could do good in this situation, despite the fact that I have in fact been wounded? Because, and maybe that's tied into this notion of striving to love your enemy. If you're going to set the world right and you could bring even your enemy back into the path of proper being, is there a way that you could conduct yourself so that what you would do is entice him? I'll tell you a story that just popped into my mind. A woman told me this story when I was in Europe. She was in a city in the Middle East, a naive American tourist, and she was walking back to her encampment, and a man stopped and offered her a ride to the encampment, and foolishly she got in the car. And he took her out in the desert, and he told her that he had been terribly abused as a child and that he was going to rape her. And he took her into the desert and was preparing to do so, stripped her and laid her on the ground. And when he climbed on top of her, she took him in her arms and told him that she loved him. And he broke down and cried and stopped. And so that's a good example. Yeah, no kidding. No kidding. Because she got under him. In the psychological sense, right? She managed even in that moment of extremity to look past his voluntary adoption of malevolence and evil, right? And to grab him by the heart and to pull him out of that abyss. And so
it wouldn't have worked with Hitler's or Stalin's torturers.
Hey,
it's critically that it's a great story. I almost cry listening to it. I've never heard it.
It's an amazing story.
But I'm not sure there's much to be extrapolated in the nature of human evil.
Well, it's always an open question, Dennis, because I think it depends to some degree on the canniness of the interlocutor. You know, I would say that if you're going to entice someone malevolent back onto the path of proper being, you have to be as canny in your good as they are in their evil. That's an echo of the notion that you should be as wise as a serpent, right? As harmless as a dove and as wise as a serpent. And I don't know what the limit to that is, because I've seen people in extreme situations walk the path so precisely that they could entice even someone hell-bent on malevolence out of that that insistence. I mean, I take your point. This is no simple matter, and it's nothing for the naive to attempt. But it's always an open question. You know, even when someone comes after you, how much of the outcome is in your control? And the answer is, to some degree, that's proportionate to the depth of your wisdom. So,
with the caveat that if you run across Adolf Hitler, it's probably a good idea to shoot him.
Well, and I would say maybe it's a good idea if you absolutely don't know something better to do. And it's not obvious, even in principle, what would be better to do in that situation. So,
he was
two quick points. First of all, I'm not certain
but he wasn't there. He wasn't.
That it's true that eye for eye,
ending.
according to this, speaking as a Christian, Old Testament logic, leads to everyone blind. I mean, this is actually a way of trying to prevent everyone ending up blind, because it's setting the limits, as you're saying, but you set the limits also by being candid about what the cost is. And if there's no consequence to the cost that's proportionate, then you end up in a completely destabilized world.
True.
But from the Christian standpoint, speaking as a Christian for the New Testament, there's no sense in the Christian tradition that kind of forgiveness obliterates the reality of the sin. Yeah. I mean, the whole tradition of confession within the Christian tradition, you can only receive you might say, the benefit of God's promise of forgiveness by owning up to what you have done. I mean, you have to name the sin and take responsibility for it. And so this logic of eye for eye is very much internalized to the whole possibility of forgiveness.
And sometimes it's the seriousness of the retribution and punishment that will bring home to the wrongdoer.
Yes.
The penitent wrongdoer.
That's precisely what leads you to weep when you acknowledge your sin.
Exactly.
Well, bring that home for today. In other words, the key, as you say, is proportionality. And here this is against an over-exaggeration. But we're in a culture, say, with prosecutors letting people off, and they're back out in the streets the next day, where the injured party feels there's no proportionality, there's no justice. You know,
that's also an incitement to vengeance on their part.
Exactly.
And a placement of the moral burden back on their shoulders, which that's not a good idea for the stability of society.
There's lots of mitigations here, but you shouldn't miss the fact that this is a hard code, right? It's firm about justice. And that's for the reasons you just stated, right? I mean, first of all, whatever happens to somebody who perpetrates a crime these days is not going to happen for a long time. And that's, too bad. It should be clear.
That sends a signal. It sends a signal about how seriously or unseriously a society and its rulers take immorality and wrongdoing.
So it's also the case possibly that once everybody has accepted the eye for an eye limitation, you might be able to aim for a moral order that supersedes that, but not until that. Right? So this might have been relevant for the time and place and a moral advance, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's the ultimate moral advance in the realm of potential moral
You can't
advances.
transcend this without admitting it. I mean, we know this in our personal lives. If someone commits a wrong against you, you can't have any reconciliation without an acknowledgement of that wrong. I mean, that's the beginning of forgiveness and reconciliation.
Right, definitely. 22, Exodus 22. We're going to jump right into 22:16. And if a man entice a maid that is not betrothed and lie with her, he shall surely endow her to be his wife. I'll read the 22:17 as well. If her father utterly refuse to give her unto him, he shall pay money according to the dowry of virgins. Okay, now this is a very interesting rule in my estimation, principle, because this isn't rape. The maid is enticed. She's attracted and does this. It's implied voluntarily, but that nonetheless, the man is obligated to make her his wife or to pay the penalty if that's impossible. And this might be worth discussing, although it's obviously very contentious. There's a pointer here to the sacrality of sex. And of course, in our culture, we're tempted to believe that sex can be mere enjoyment, a form of entertainment, I would say, a light form of entertainment even. And that the reason that that's the case is because, in principle, we have reliable birth control, and so the consequences of the sexual act that have been lessened in their heaviness. And so then the question opens up in front of us: if we have reliable birth control, is sex then now to be properly regarded as just another form of entertainment, or does it carry with it the burden of something approximating permanent relationship? And my sense is that even though the technology has enabled us to prevent the ultimate consequences of the act, I don't believe that mitigates the seriousness of the interaction. And I think the fact that we've lost that has damaged intimate relationships almost beyond repair by making the part of them that is most significant emotionally and physically into something that's now as trivial as the lightest of entertainment. I don't think it's done us well, and now obviously that's quite a conservative position in the political sense, but everything I see going on around me seems to point to...
Conservative or rational? I'm not being cute. Why is it conservative? Conservative might be prescriptive, but what you've described, I read over and over in left-wing sources, in progressive sources, how many depressed young women there are in the culture of our what is it called again? The
hookup.
The hookup culture.
Yeah, right.
Very few people would say that this has benefited women.
Well, I also see in the left-wing culture there's this strange splitting of attitude towards sexuality. And so on the one hand, there's this proposition that every possible variant expression of sexual desire and action is not only permissible, but to be celebrated in a mandatory manner. But simultaneously, every single interaction that's even vaguely sexual between a young man and a young woman is so pregnant with danger, so to speak, that it has to be reduced to an explicit contractual arrangement before it can even be undertaken. And so I think the fact that both of those exist, those tendencies exist on the left simultaneously, the left being that part of our political discourse that tends toward the breaking of arbitrary constraints, that's an indication that there's some underlying set of regulating principles that's been violated. You get an excess in libertinism on the all sexual proclivities are to be celebrated front, and the simultaneous legalism that emerges, because that does put young women in in uncomfortable situations that are extraordinarily hard on them. So you get questions arising, for example, well, can a young woman give consent to a sexual interaction of any sort if she's intoxicated by alcohol. And it isn't the right-wingers who are bringing up that issue fundamentally. It's the left-wingers, and their answer is, well, no, absolutely not.
That's a contradiction of tectonic proportions
absolutely.
within that worldview.
What it isn't a contradiction with, though, is this.
Yeah.
I mean, this is not reciprocal. This is this is saying that if I don't see here an equal and opposite commandment. If a woman entices a man to sleep with him, then she's
forced to marry him. Right?
No, this is the view here is that men have an absolute responsibility not to engage in commitmentless sex, and that to do so is to take or do something that is not reciprocal, and you know. So conservatives who want to point out these hypocrisies in the left should have to grapple with whether they are prepared to speak a kind of truth to power to men and say, this is intrinsic to your masculinity, is to take responsibility in this regard.
There's that famous documentary that came out recently, What is a Woman? And there's actually a biological answer to that question. There's a multitude of them. One of them is, maybe you could say this, that's the principle of the biological reality, is that the female is that sex which takes primary responsibility for reproduction and bears disproportionate weight in doing so. That's what constitutes female, and that's true right at the level of sperm and ova. And it propagates, it's fractal. And so the reason it's the man that's taking advantage here is because the price he'll pay for it is nowhere near as high as the price she'll pay for it, either emotionally or conceivably practically. And so it is fundamentally his sin, right? And I think it's very much...
The confusion in the young, I mean, so I work in a very odd kind of college. It's a good one. But we figured out that the kids don't understand much about sex. And so we started offering a course called The Theology of the Body. And it is the most popular course on the campus now. And, you know, we're having to recruit half the faculty to teach it. Because
using the teachings of John Paul II?
Yeah, such things, you know. In other words, it's... they understand sex is very consequential, right? It's a big thing. And in what way is it a big thing? And how should you, because they want it, they're human. What is its purpose? And all of that, right? And it's not enough to say, because like we're talking about details here that are almost romantic, because the preciousness of a woman, her, we teach the young men, don't foul that. That's a wonderful thing, and they, listen, it's good for them.
Conservatives like to talk a lot about the hatred of men and the diminution and the problems in the education system. They're completely right to do so. But we really have to ask, I mean, to what extent some of it is a consequence of the abdication of fundamental responsibilities?
Yeah, well, I think it's not only an abdication of fundamental responsibilities, it's also a diminution of the pleasure principle itself, because I don't believe that it's unreasonable to make the presumption that there is no more sacred act than sexual congress in some fundamental sense. And then what that means is that to diminish that to the status of light entertainment is to take the thing in your life that could be among the highest and to make that nothing but that which is casual. And that means there's no increment on the hedonic side at all, quite the contrary. And I would say I think part of the evidence for that seems to be that more and more young people aren't having sex. They're not engaging in relationships. Well, they're not having sex with another person. I mean, pornography use is rife, although even there's now evidence that among young men, the proportion of young men who have zero sex, which includes even the use of pornography, has started to climb up dramatically. And so it could easily be that we put ourselves in a situation where making sex as freely accessible as possible and as casual as might be imaginable has actually demolished its hedonic utility as well as its as well as its integration within a broader set of moral constraints.
This may be very obvious, but if you take your view, which I agree with totally, there's a way towards that, and this is safeguarding. In other words, the young man who's done that hasn't gone through the betrothal and the dowry and all that sort of stuff. So it's a protection of the very ways that the Jews saw you had to approach marriage.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Isn't there also a sort of philosophical, anthropological paradox that some of the most animal aspects of human life are also the most distinctively non-animal at the same time? Mm-hmm. So, for example, the meal. Mm-hmm. No other animal has a meal. And they feed, but they don't have a meal together. So for us, the meal, it's no accident that in great religious traditions, a meal has profound symbolism. The Eucharist is one that springs to mind, but there are many others, of course. Exactly. This is the sacred. And isn't it also true with sexual relations that this is at the same time the most animal, and yet it's a point where we distinguish ourselves from all other animals, and it's precisely, I think.
I think that's an extremely wise point, also because it is the case that it's easy for the pull of our animal nature to entice us into a state of profound self-consciousness and shame. And that frequently happens, and I think it happens more often, to women who sleep around casually. And we could extend that to women who sleep around casually when they're intoxicated by alcohol and wake up the next morning and think, well, just what the hell did I do? And the shame emerges. And then you might say, well, what's the antidote to that shame? And it has to be perhaps that the pull of that animal nature has to be balanced by the sacralization of the enterprise. And that is the way, and that's the way out of the shame. And hypothetically, when you read about sexual utopian communes, for example, what's lurking in the background consistently is this idea that we could just, wouldn't it be wonderful if we could just dispense with our shame of nakedness and with our sexual shame? And the proper response to that might be something like, well, you can't dispense with it. The best you can do is integrate it into a subsidiary structure and elevate it, and it's through the elevation that the shame is eradicated, but not as a consequence of the mere dispensation with shame, which isn't, I don't think, unless you're psychopathic, I don't think it's possible.
One little additional thought. I have spoken on campuses by sheer coincidence on some occasions, not most, but on some. It was Sex Week, which virtually every American campus has. I assume Canadian campuses have as well. And the campus is sort of drenched in sexual discussions, exhibitions, et cetera. And
I'm naive. I never heard of Sex Week.
Well, you're at Hillsdale.
You're at Hillsdale, yeah. There's no sex week at Hillsdale.
Sex Week, yeah. If Hillsdale has Sex Week, invite me. And it was a little depressing, actually, and I think it became clear, I'm certainly not prudish on the matter, which sadly one always has to add when one discusses sex, which is a tragedy in and of itself. But in any event, I'm just thinking, and this is a wild thought, would the average student on an average campus be happier if there was a Bible week or a sex week? Just in terms of happiness.
Mm-hmm. So, I would also like to point out on the clinical front, just for the sake of argument, that there are markers of antisocial personality. And so that would be a proclivity towards the exploitation of others, the criminal exploitation of others. And that's a pretty stable pattern of behavior in human beings. It tends to last across the life course. It's very difficult to moderate with any psychological or sociological interventions. And there's a cloud of symptoms, patterns of behavior and thought that are associated with criminality, exploitative criminality. Predatory parasitism is the most extreme form of criminal proclivity. And one of the hallmarks of antisocial personality is multiple early sexual partners. And so the criminal types tend to engage in short-term mating strategies, and what that means is that they don't integrate their drive towards sexual gratification into any subsidiary structure. There's no long-term commitment to themselves or to other people. And I think that's very interesting that that is a hallmark of antisocial personality, because it makes you wonder then if the group of persons who is pushing hard for a kind of naive sexual libertinism on the grounds of hedonism, if that's also not expressed, under what circumstances that's also not an expression of this same kind of callousness, callous exploitativeness that's a hallmark of antisocial personality. It's a perfectly reasonable technical question, because the more civilized people, the ones who are farthest from criminal behavior, are those who are more likely to engage in stable, long-term, monogamous relationships. Mm-hmm. And that's clear. That's another example of this bottom-up propensity, right? There's a biological reality there too. Because you might say, well, the biological reality is that we're propelled by our lust, the biological drive, but it's way more complicated than that. There's also a drive towards the integration of sexuality into a higher order pattern of being that's much more stable and much more likely to be reproductively successful, for example. So psychopathy is 3% of the population. It's not a great reproductive strategy. It works better than it's better than not having sex at all. But it's not a good, long-term, stable reproductive strategy.
Can I ask about the next verse, 17? If the father refuses to give the maid over in marriage to the man, he has to pay money according to the dowry of virgins. What's going on there?
Well, it means that she is still not forced to marry him. Right. He entices her, he has to marry her. But what if the family refuses? And almost all of history, in every civilization until the modern, the family determined your spouse. So she's not forced to marry the man. Mm-hmm. That's what it says.
And the money is as if
he still has to pay a penalty.
Right. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
22:18, and let's do 22:18 and 19 together. Sure. Thou shalt not suffer a witch to live, and whosoever lieth with a beast shall surely be put to death. So, anyone want to tackle the witch?
Oz had a good insight on this, and maybe you should want to show how they relate to each other.
Well, I got it from the rabbis and Leon Kass.
Yeah.
In other words, again, your idea that the death penalty is not for everyone, that's important here. But Leon Kass says, we've come from Egypt and we're going to Canaan. And both of them destroy the boundaries. So you're made in the image of God. You are God-like, so you're not an animal. All you said about that is right. You're not an animal. But you are God-like, but you're not God. Now, the Egyptians were ones who destroyed the boundaries upwards through the mastery of technology and rationality. And the Canaanites were the ones who destroyed the boundaries downwards. So the Egyptians,
explain how did they do that?
The Canaanites?
How did they do that?
The Canaanites?
It's in that book you're talking about. What?
Yeah, through wild sexual frenzies, Dionysian festivals, and so on.
So a sinking back into unthinking
animal
nature. Mm-hmm.
Irrational, and so on. In other words, the boundaries are there because we're made in the image of God, and one way we try and break them is through the mastery of technology. We become gods. You think of Yuval Harari and people like that today. And what you're describing, the hookup culture, is the opposite. You destroy the boundaries downwards and just indulge our animal nature.
Mm-hmm. When you say technology, you mean embalming and...
Well, in this context, presumably it would be sorcery is an attempt.
I mean, the desire to control the world
in a godlike way.
That's
through power.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And then remember, Moses' opponents were sorcerers in Egypt.
So the idea would be that it's two verses that are related to each other. One which is, do not make yourself like a god and try to control the world through power, but then also do not become like an animal and join yourself with an animal. And it's explicit, right? Don't have sex with animals, but it also brings about just the notion of don't let yourself fall into that animal state at the same time.
And why would you associate specifically the prohibition against allowing a witch to live? Are you associating
Not
that
a
with-
witch. John should come in here. No, this is the Egyptian sorcerer who is the secret arts
They
of
are
technology.
related, though. You're right.
But it's
Okay,
important
okay.
to say.
Both destroy boundaries.
But
Okay.
it's important to
Okay.
say, I mean, this is maybe a little bit of a tangent, but for people who watch and will have been told the worst aspect of history, Christian witch burning is very much misunderstood by most people. In fact, witch burning was a pagan practice. It wasn't just something that you find in the Bible, but witch burning was a Roman practice. And in fact, in the transition into Christianity, witch burning was prohibited. We never find any witch burning in Constantinople. And witch burning is prohibited in the West. For example, Charlemagne made a funny statement. He made it into a joke. He said, if anybody burns a witch, they will be burned alive. And so it's only in the very early modern times that witch burning comes back. So
Why is that
16th
funny?
century. Sorry?
Why is that funny?
It's funny because it's like saying, if you burn a witch, then the consequence will fall back on you. It was trying to make an irony out of the situation, because they actually said that witchcraft was nonsense, and the early Christians thought witchcraft was just hocus pocus. It was total nonsense, and it's only in the 16th century into the 17th century that witch burning comes back, and mostly through secular courts. The Catholic Church actually did not engage with the hammer of witches and all of the kind of crazy stuff that was going on in the European world. And so the Enlightenment folks, they projected witch burning back into the Middle Ages when it was in fact something of their own time.
So I understand Oz's point about technology, and I'll just mention that C.S. Lewis says that in the early Renaissance, late medieval, there was a contest between magicians and science. And they wanted the same thing. They wanted to control nature. They wanted to overcome God. And that magic was impotent and science was strong, and so it replaced it.
This is Keith Thomas's thesis, I think, isn't it?
But I think this double drive, mastery and merging, is so strong today. And you know, the rationalist, secularist, man as God, and on the other hand, the merging.
No, you're right.
No, it's very interesting
Destroy
way of
every
conceptualize
boundary.
the
No binaries.
Yeah, well, that's a degeneration into chaos on the one hand,
Exactly.
and an
And I think
elevation
this is
into a
where
kind
we
of
are today.
rigid technocracy on the other. Yeah, and we do see that playing out in our culture with the increasing proclivity of globalist utopian leaders
Exactly.
to adopt a top-down Tower of Babel approach, and also the insistence that we merge back into an undifferentiated nature on the hedonistic side.
Exactly.
So instead of, that's a chaos, excessive chaos and excessive order problem
Well, this is
as
what
well.
C.S. Lewis called the abolition of man in, I think, one of the great works of the 20th century. It's a rather small text, but it is a
Dense.
but it's I think a prophetic work.
And you read it in light of the boundary issue that Oz is laying forth.
Yes, I mean it's a pronounced critique of relativism and subjectivism. So it starts off with a reference to Coleridge, and it's a passage taken from a school book, a textbook
from the
at the
1940s,
time,
yeah.
exactly, for the 1940s. I think they've actually discovered which textbook it was. And Coleridge is describing the appearance of a waterfall and criticizing the one observer who says that the sublime waterfall is pretty, and Coleridge makes the point: no, this is an error, And in the textbook that Lewis is criticizing, the view is, well, of course this is absurd because we merely project our feelings onto the universe. There is no objective reality about it in the way that Coleridge was claiming. Now, this is Lewis's starting point as a critique of a society that has lost a sense of objective order, has lost a sense that the facts of the world are suffused with values and objective values. And he sees that as leading on the one hand to this sort of deracinated subjectivism, but also at the same time an obsession with technology and control and a destruction of the sense of the human. So that, hence the title of the book, The Abolition of Man.
Don't you think we are even more radical today? So relativism, emotivism, but constructivism, it's an explicit assault on creation.
No, it's more than an assault on creation, because the consequence of that subjectivism is not only, as far as I can tell, the inevitable demolition of the sacred order, but also the demolition of the scientific order.
Oh, because of all order, absolutely.
Right, but it's so interesting because it's a branch of, you could think about it as an errant branch of atheistic materialism, or maybe its logical conclusion, and it clearly poses a threat to religious traditionalism. But I think that it's becoming increasingly clear that it imposes an equal threat to the integrity of the scientific endeavor as such.
That's
right,
explicit.
and that's so interesting that both of those are happening at the same time.
That's explicit in the novel that C.S. Lewis names as a partner to Abolition of Man, because what are these scientists at this evil institution, what do they turn to? They turn to magic and demons, because science too can't give them everything they want.
22:20, he that sacrificeth unto any god, save unto the Lord only, he shall be utterly destroyed. That brings us into a discussion of sacrifice, and I think this line is interesting to me because there's a pragmatism about it that's outside of the legalism. So you might say, well, if you sacrifice to another god, you should justly be punished. But there's an implication here, I think, that if you sacrifice to the wrong god, you will be punished. And the reason for that, in part, is that you sacrifice by working, by sacrificing the future, by sacrificing the present to the future. That's really the definition of work. Or by sacrificing what's only selfish to the broader community. That's a sacrificial gesture. And it has to be sacrifice in relationship to a goal. And then you might say, well, if you make extremely diligent sacrifices to the wrong goal, in some sense you're worse off than not making the sacrifices at all. And so maybe that's reflected in the social norms. You should be punished for sacrificing to the wrong god.
Can I offer a powerful example of what you're saying? A few years ago, the daughter of an European Union official, a German major figure in the European Parliament, I believe it might have been the German Parliament, I think it was the EU, was gang raped. And it was by foreigners. But she was so committed to diversity and the non-judgment of any foreigner that she said it was Germans who gang raped her.
Right,
her own rape.
That.
She sacrificed the truth of her own rape to that false god.
22:21. This is an example of the broadening of the law in a fundamental manner, and so part of the moral revolution that's part and parcel of this revelatory structure. Thou shalt neither vex a stranger nor oppress him. So there's the idea of the universality of the law. For you were strangers in the land of Egypt. Then that's extended down to the poor and those who are powerless. Ye shall not afflict any widow or fatherless child. If thou afflict them in any wise, and they cry at all unto me, I will surely hear their cry, and my wrath shall wax hot, and I will kill you with the sword, and your wives shall be widows, and your children fatherless.
The people who dump on the Bible should have to answer where else there was a law that you must not oppress the foreigner, the stranger.
Foreigner, the widow, the poor. It's a pretty nice list there. And that this
but
is
especially the stranger.
Yes, especially, absolutely. Because, this, you know, in the anthropological literature, that general proclivity for tribal communities is to call themselves humans. And everyone who isn't in their tribe isn't human. And so they don't fall under the same law at all. They're not even of the same kind. Well, kind means kin. Kind is K-I-N with a D on the end of it. Why would the law extend to those who are not of your kind? And so you see a glimmering, well, more than a glimmering here of that. You see an injunction that in some fundamental manner the stranger is entitled to the same protection as your own kin. Yeah, that is, it's almost impossible to understand how revolutionary that is.
It's the invention of humanity, and it provides the conceptual structure and foundations for modern notions of human rights, surely, including Enlightenment notions.
Right. Another argument for the divinity. I just had to throw that in.
Yeah, well, it's at minimum an argument for the emergence of something that looks like an implicit universal moral order. And distinguishing that from the divine is no easy thing, even conceptually. So, and I mean, it's really hard on atheists, I would say, a line like this, because it's like, well, is this something you believe? Do you buy this? Why exactly would you extend the protection of the law beyond your kin? Where does that impetus come from? That's a very tough problem to sort out. And it's also a great set of lines to push back against the narrative that this ancient book is somehow fundamentally the expression of an oppressive patriarchal spirit. It's like, well, it doesn't look like it, not here. These are pretty harsh words. If you inflict them in any wise and they cry at all unto me, I will surely hear their cry. So the patriarchal God of the Old Testament is putting himself firmly on the side of those victimized by the unfair
and there's
administration of power.
Interesting eye for eye in the structure of this, where it's like, if you oppress the stranger, the widows, and the fatherless children, then your wife will become a widow, and then your children will be fatherless.
Dennis, what do we make of the command that for which the Israelites are punished to kill all the people in the Promised Land?
You mean that they will die before they get into the Promised Land? They will die in the wilderness?
Well, no, like King Saul is punished because
he didn't slaughter the enemy.
Kill them all.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Well,
Dennis gets the hard questions in the last couple of days.
You guys are tough. I have a different view of post-Torah Old Testament. I believe that much of it is divinely inspired, but I don't believe that it emanates directly from God as I do the Torah, which is a traditional Jewish view. It's not my idiosyncratic one. So problems that you will bring from the book of Joshua or Judges, for example, and there are, I don't always have an answer to, and it doesn't trouble me, because the net result, and I'll tell you why it doesn't trouble me. Any specific difficult act, like wipe out the Midianites or Canaanites, or in the case of King Saul, they're all specific to the moment. If the Hebrew Bible ever said, Jews, I want you to wipe out everyone that you ever fight with, all their children and all their wives, I would not be a believer, and not at this table.
Well, there's another issue there.
That's why you get the hard questions, by the way. You can answer them.
That's relevant, too.
Thank you. Yeah,
one of the
try.
things, so when I had my debates with Sam Harris, and this is something that Sam used to do, sort of a postmodern trick, but it's a good one, is to say that I make the case that there's an emerging moral order, let's say, in the Old Testament. He says, well, you're just reading into that, right? It's just a projection. And I thought, well, it's not a projection. How do you tell the difference between something that you're just imagining and something that's really there? In a text, classic postmodern question, is there any meaning in the text at all? Well, there's a technical answer to that psychologists have developed, and the answer is something exists if you can measure it using multiple different measurement techniques that are historically separated in their development, so they're qualitatively different, and they all report the same pattern. And so your senses do that. You have 5 senses and you think something's real if all 5 senses report the same thing. And often that's not even enough because you ask someone else. But what you're trying to do is get multiple independent streams of revelation that point to the same thing. Well, you can do the same thing in a text, and your brother does this brilliantly in his book, The Language of Creation, because one of his techniques is to say, well, here's a pattern that I pulled out of this text. And here's how this pattern replicates itself across 20 different texts that were written at a different time. And so the idea there would be that maybe the depth of the proclamation in the Old Testament corpus is proportionate to the proclivity for that pattern to be repeated across multiple texts. Because your point is, well, it just shows up once. It's particularized to a time and place. There is no implication that it's a universal law, either in that text or across a multiplicity of texts. You made the opposite argument with regard to the crime of murder earlier. So, and I think that's a good technical answer. It's like, well, how often is that pattern?
Honest technical
yeah,
answer.
Yeah, definitely. And I think there's a technical answer to it, is that if it's detectable through multiple means of measurement, then the probability that it's a mere projection is decreased radically.
Yeah.
And Matthew does a great job of that in the text. And
no, these are completely rational principles of interpretation.
Right.
Yes,
They're perfectly
exactly.
plausible.
right. Okay. So
That's why I call my commentary the Rational Bible.
So 22:25 ends chapter 22 for our purposes. This is a complicated one because we're in a society now that charges interest. If thou lend money to any of my people that is poor by thee, thou shalt not be to him as a usurer, neither shalt thou lay upon him usury. The Mohammedan world, the Islamic world, has taken that, a similar idea, to an extreme. Their economic systems aren't reliant on the use of money lent at interest.
Which is true in Christendom until the Reformation.
Right.
In the Christian tradition, you are not allowed to lend with interest within the Christian world, and it's only Calvin, I think, who changed that.
Okay, and so
all kinds of ways around that, though, right?
Islamic finance has
Yeah. Well, there has to be ways around it.
But the question is why? That's the question. Why was it important for the early Christians, even though people would always get around whatever rule you put?
Well, it's
and why
important
is it
so they
there
wouldn't be
in the
mafia
text?
dons. It's like, pay me 25%, next week, or I'll break your legs. That's a bad extension of that property. And maybe if you can set up a system where that's constrained and regulated, then. But this is a pretty stark. It seems like a stark prohibition. And so,
for loaning to the very poor, and not for those who will use the money you loan them to do a business with. The assumption is if they make money from your money, then that's a different type of interest
so is
loan.
that why is to any of my people that is poor by thee?
Yes, that's right. It's not a ban on loans.
Right, so it's a ban
only
on.
with regard to the very poor. Help them out. So basically, it's really an injunction for charity.
I see. So
that's
it's
really what it
don't
is.
charge people below the poverty line 30% on their credit cards.
Sounds right.
So I've been thinking about this quite a bit, honestly, and I don't totally understand it. But what I do understand is that the fact that we set that aside in the contemporary world, and the fact that we have set up an entire financial system based on credit, it seems to accelerate reality. It seems to have an effect on the way in which we live. Because what credit does is that you're borrowing from the future. That's what you're doing. You're saying, I don't have this now. I'm going to get it from outside of me, and I'm going to pull it to myself. And then what it does is it creates a strange wheel that seems to accelerate. And I think that the acceleration of the modern world seems to have something to do with credit.
Well, it has something to do with the efficiency of financial markets, and certainly the provision of credit. Well, it is greasing the wheel. I don't think anybody would dispute that. Your point is that there's a danger in that we're not contending with, that it's an artificial acceleration of the rate of transformation. We risk doing that to such an effective degree that we might not be able to cope with the consequences.
Because the way that states do it is particularly visible, right? It's like what you're doing is you're just putting your problem on the future. You're basically taking your problem, throwing it out, and saying, "Oh, we'll deal with this later." And so there's something about credit which has that structure.
To be clear,
Which I think about it in somebody's like somebody who's irresponsible with credit. That's what ends up happening, right? It's like they borrow. It's like, yeah, I've got a car, I've got this, I've got that, and then all of a sudden it hits them. The way in which states do it seems to be playing over a longer period of time, but we can see the wall coming, and we don't quite know what it's going to look like when, financing of the debt is equal to the GDP of a country or something crazy like that, which is completely possible that it will happen at some point.
to be clear, there's not a prohibition against loaning and borrowing here. You're allowed to loan money, just not without interest.
Yeah.
And I take it what you're saying, Jonathan, is that for whatever benefits might be described on the other side in terms of efficiency and so on, I'm not persuaded there shouldn't be interest. What it does is it accelerates, it makes easier, it incentivizes borrowing, right? Because you might make money. We've got to be clear here that this is going to disincentivize
But it also,
borrowing,
but
right?
like what I mean by it accelerates is that it accelerates, right? It's like I borrow $5 and now I have to pay back $7. So I have to produce more than what I needed in the first place in order to pay it back. So think about that cycle. If you make it into a system, it creates a cycle that just will necessarily accelerate.
Well, enormous service has been done on borrowed money and fortunes made. So I think Dennis's distinction is fundamental, right? If you live on your credit card so you can party more, that'll bite you.
I mean, I have a credit card. I'm just trying to understand why Christians would have banned this for 1,000 years.
If people borrow money to start businesses all the time, and they build a life for themselves that way. And bankers are pretty good at figuring out if they can pay the money back, and they bear the cost if they can't. So that, it's different than
Usury.
running up your credit card bills, right?
And it's different from loaning money to people can never pay it back and enslaving them permanently as a consequence.
And Dennis says, according to the Torah, that if you loan money to people that can't pay it back, that the poor people, you can't charge them interest. Because in that case,
that's the law.
In that case, it's not an investment, right?
Right.
But has there ever been a practice that Jews amongst themselves do not loan on with
it's
interest?
fascinating you should ask. Well through the 20th century, one of the first things every Jewish community set up was called a Jewish Free Loan Society, where the poorest Jews got loans without interest. And that was what it was called, a free loan society. And it was understood that you don't take advantage of this to make money on the money we give you, that you need it to live. So as I said, it's essentially a charitable, but it's a beautiful thing. It's better than charity because it keeps your dignity. You didn't get charity from the community, you got a loan. So you have to pay it back. Charity you don't have to pay back. So there's a beautiful thing that charity is being called a loan in this verse.
Oh, that gives people the opportunity to engage in reciprocity, right?
Yep.
And anyone, the problem with the gift-giving charitable approach is that the drive to reciprocity is an extremely deep part of the moral foundation of human interaction. Everyone who's civil in the sophisticated sense, and anyone who isn't antisocial and psychopathic, feels a moral obligation when granted something to reciprocate in some manner, to set the scales straight. And I think part of the reason for that is we recognize that in the long run, across multiple interactions, the scales have to be balanced. It's incumbent upon to be a player who does that. And so there's remarkably sophisticated psychoeconomic experiments that demonstrate people's commitment to that deep requirement for reciprocity, even when they're extraordinarily stricken by poverty. In fact, they become more assiduous in pursuing that principle when it's difficult for them to reciprocate practically. So at least they have their morality, you might say, right, even if they don't have the money. We'll go to Exodus 23. I'll read a few at once here, I think, maybe 6 or 7. because they're excellent indications of the emergence of quite a sophisticated morality. It's certainly not one that's reliant on an immediate impulse for vengeance or on the expression of power. Quite the contrary. 23:1, thou shalt not raise a false report, nor put not thine hand with the wicked to be an unrighteous witness. We discussed that to some degree yesterday. Thou shalt not follow a multitude to do evil. Right, don't participate in a mob. There's a good one for the modern world. Neither shalt thou speak in a cause to decline after many, to wrest judgment. Neither shalt thou countenance a poor man in his cause. That's an interesting one. What does it mean? Just because the person's poor or rich doesn't mean that you alter justice.
Against social justice.
Yeah, yeah.
That is it in one verse in the Bible.
Yeah, right, absolutely.
Social justice is you favor the poor in judgment. Justice is you do not favor anybody in
period.
Judgment. Period.
Yeah, right. Yeah, absolutely. That's Exodus 23:3. Burn that on the back of our imaginations. Neither shalt that countenance a poor man in his cause merely because he's poor. Yeah, that's remarkably sophisticated. Or patriarchally oppressive, depending on how you look at it.
The former.
If thou meet thine enemy's ox or his ass going astray, thou shalt surely bring it back to him again, even if he's your enemy. If thou see the ass of him that hateth thee lying under his burden, and wouldest forbear to help him, thou shalt surely help with him. Thou shalt not wrest the judgment of thy poor in his cause. Keep thee far from a false matter, and the innocent and righteous slay thou not, for I will not justify the wicked. And thou shalt take no bribe, essentially. For the gift, thou shalt take no gift, for the gift blindeth the wise and perverteth the words of the righteous. And so that's 8 laws there. Anybody have a comment on any of them or all?
I love the way that we're starting to see now attached to the laws and the ordinances a sort of little explanations, not with every single one of them, but they're kind of unpacked. I mean, I was actually this struck me from the previous chapter, but the same applies to these verses too. But I'm thinking, this is verse 27 of the previous chapter. You've got to, you can't take the covering from anybody, because you can't take clothes from anybody, because what will he sleep in? And you can't do this because I am gracious. So it's unpacking the law. These are not just kind of brute edicts. They are understandable, and the law is a teacher. It has a pedagogical function for a society. It can shape its moral culture.
Right, and you're referring to the fact that these are legitimate unfoldings and differentiations of an underlying source, a set of principles, of fundamental principles. And they're coherent in that manner.
They're coherent, and they're transparent. They're legible. They're open to reason.
Right.
They're not mysterious.
They have a logos.
Yeah, there's a clarity and a rationale.
So you're saying, James, that these are not brute dictates, but actually grounded in the goodness of God.
That's
so
right.
It's because God is gracious and generous and caring. That's why, not simply because He commands it.
Right.
That's right. Also, God wants
that means
us to
they're
understand.
Sorry, go ahead.
He's teaching us here.
Yeah.
See,
that's right.
if you absorb this and the reason for this, it'll make you better more generally.
Right. And so that's a very different attitude than kind of a unthinking Rousseauian view where human beings are intrinsically good and it's only social order that corrupts them. This is an alternative view that says, no, there's a minimum set of necessary principles and punishments that have to be put in place so that people can be good and generous, like the spirit that is producing the law. And that also means that the law is not to be regarded as just the walls against fundamental drives. They're more like enabling. They're the enabling principles of the good itself.
It's like the point that Jonathan made yesterday about the importance of transformation and a kind of moral transformation, the transformation of one's character, and not getting too obsessed with what this law does or what this law prohibits and so on. It's really the idea that the law is a guide, it's a teacher, and once you grasp its underlying rationale, sort of this context. I am compassionate, I am gracious, therefore you must be too. And once one learns that grace, learns that compassion, then as it were, the need for the law, I mean, it doesn't fall away completely, but as it were, it's fulfilled in some way and transcended.
It's not accidental that it's a body of laws, right? Because laws are something you embody, and that means that they are the patterns by which your spirit unfolds itself in action. And so you are being disciplined in a manner that shapes you in a particular spiritual direction. If you assume, we could assume the laws are coherent, they stem from the manifestation of an underlying spirit that unites and that draws people away from tyranny, because that's obviously the narrative implication of the book. You're no longer going to be slaves laboring under the terrible hand of a tyrant. You're going to be free and sovereign citizens. But here's the necessary set of principles that you have to abide by to both become that sort of people and to organize yourself socially.
That's the essence of covenant. They constitute you. And that's...
And why would you say that's the essence of covenant?
Because the covenant is constituting them in every way. They're making promises, and as you see, this is the framework, the guide, the pedagogy, and so on. They're going to constitute a new people, God's priests, and so on. And that's what we've lost today.
Well,
Americans just see the Constitution as a law.
Right, as prohibitions as well.
And the Constitution is America.
Yeah, well, and that's why it says Constitution too, because it constitutes you. Well, you see this, you can think about this psychologically. You know that if you have a good paternal spirit in your family, so you have a good relationship with your father, that the father places the responsibility of upholding certain principles on you, and that's enforced. But the point of that isn't so much to constrain and inhibit as it is to develop and facilitate. And the development and facilitation should be the creation of a new benevolent father out of an unruly child, let's say, so that process can be transmitted down the generations. And I mean, one of the things you do with children, if you pay attention to them, is judiciously, encouragement is partly the judicious use of prohibition. It's like, no, you can't do that, kid. That's beneath you. It's truly beneath you. That has to come to a stop. It's not going to work out well for you. It isn't going to help you become the sort of person that I know you are and could be. And that does require judicious prohibition. But it's not the imposition of a tyrannical force against the creative, the creative spirit of the child. It's the pathway that creative spirit has to tread in order to become fully manifest.
Well, it is somewhat tyrannical, and I defend it. Love your neighbor as yourself. I am the Lord. I am the Lord telling you to do this. And the reasons that the midwives did not kill the Jewish male babies that were born was because they feared God. And they, as I add, didn't fear Pharaoh. There is an element of quote-unquote tyranny to goodness.
But is it authority or backup? But you're using that rhetorically in some sense. I mean, you mean authoritative.
I do.
Yes.
So okay, and so we agree on authoritative.
Absolutely.
Meaning that there's an authority.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
But authority also includes the possibility that it's a coherent. Like it's authoritative in the sense that it actually constitutes the right way to be. It's not just like someone says do this because I said so.
Well, but we assume that God knows what He's saying. I mean, without that assumption, this whole enterprise is pointless.
It's authoritative.
We assume God knows what's best.
This is covenantal, not a dictatorship, because the people buy in. It comes from the Lord.
Well, they did. This was something that we raised tangentially yesterday. Did they buy in? So here's a beauty for you from the Midrash. That is the Jewish philosophical tales of at least 2,000 years of age. God held Mount Sinai over the heads of the Jews and threatened to drop it on them if they didn't accept the Torah. That is an ancient Jewish famous Midrash, one of my favorites. Because I can't imagine people saying, what a great idea, especially men. Do not commit adultery. Man, sign me up. It's do not steal. Gee, I'm on board with that. According to a fantastic course on the history of the Catholic Church I listened to on recordings, the thing I remember best was he said how difficult it was for the Catholic Church to convert the Germanic tribes. They were the last ones. And you know why? When they said, so if we become Catholic, what do we have to do? Well, for one thing, you can't murder. You can't kill. And they go, what are you talking about? We're out. That's how we operate. We operate on killing. So of course, there's an element of a fear of God that has to take place.
I think you can have that while maintaining the notion of voluntary. I wouldn't say compliance. Voluntary participation, because I think that I can agree voluntarily to cooperate with someone I know to be tremendously powerful. I can still agree with it voluntarily. And so you can still have that authority lurking in the background, and even the fear of that authoritative spirit, let's say, without that necessarily compromising the fact that it's voluntary.
If we had signs up on the roads, forgive me, I know I'll forget this. If we had signs up on roads, everybody agrees that there have to be traffic laws. No one would differ with that. But if we drop traffic laws or penalties for violation of them, and we just put up signs, drive carefully, or drive however your heart deems appropriate driving to be, it would be mayhem. I'm a big fan of a divinely based order of laws to make a better society. Nothing else seems to work.
We agree with the authoritative and where it comes from, but if you say tyrannical, you undermine.
I agree with you totally.
Totally.
I only used it because Jordan did, and you meant to.
Sure,
yes.
make it my fault.
Yeah, no.
So if the
One answer to your,
that was precious.
You're right. The medieval rabbis, I've read that too, but the opposition points out that the people buy into it in Exodus before they hear the details.
We will do and we will observe, right?
Yeah.
Is that what you're referring to?
All the Lord says we will do.
And then they rebelled the rest of the Bible.
That's the reason for the explanations that James notices, right? In other words, he gives reasons. And so both things are in there, right? For the laws that are not good are harder to enforce. But all laws need to be enforced.
So the appeal in verse 9, 23:9, is both it's authoritative, but it's also explicating a kind of a logic. It's appealing both to reason and to, empathy, isn't it? It says you shan't oppress the stranger because you yourselves were strangers.
Well, there can be a carrot and a stick in a voluntary, authoritative relationship.
So the culpability of breaking that is not simply disobedience to the divine, but a kind of there's an irrationality.
But Americans have not signed on to do not favor the poor in judgment. Just for the record, on this, the people signing on to good laws, I wish that were true.
Well, that's the radical left, and they're totally opposed to this.
Yes.
That's right.
More opposed to this than they are opposed to anything else.
Yeah.
But ask a college student. I would be next time I speak at a college, I'm going to ask for a raise of hands. How many of you do think that if there is a billionaire and a poor man in a court case, we should not favor the poor man?
That's a very good, very interesting thing to do. Do a Twitter poll and find out what people think on that. Okay, so this is what I'm going to do. We're going to close with 23. There's about 9 or 10 verses here that have to do with something we already covered to some degree, which is the commandment of God to move into a foreign land and to wreak a certain degree of mayhem. So I'll close with that, and we can discuss that. I think we should probably focus on the interpretation that you laid forth before, the particularity of this commandment, and we should discuss it, and then we'll close for today. So this is 23:20. The narrative shifts gears. Behold, I send an angel before thee, speaking to the entire people of Israel, to keep thee in thy way, and to bring thee into the place which I have prepared. So that's the land of milk and honey, right, that the Israelites are journeying towards. Beware of him and obey his voice. Provoke him not. So the question is, what is this angel? For he will not pardon your transgressions, for my name is in him. But if thou shalt indeed obey his voice, and do all that I speak, then I will be an enemy unto thine enemies, and an adversary unto thine adversaries. Conditions for success in battle. That's what's being laid out. For mine angel shall go before thee, and bring thee in unto the Amorites, the Hittites, and the Perizzites, and the Canaanites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites, and I will cut them off. Thou shalt not bow down to their gods, nor serve them, nor do after their works, but thou shalt utterly overthrow them, and quite break down their images. And ye shall serve the Lord your God, and he shall bless thy bread and thy water, and I will take sickness away from the midst of thee. There shall nothing cast their young, nor be barren in thy land. The number of thy days I will fulfill. I will send my fear before thee, and will destroy all the people to whom thou shalt come, and I will make all thine enemies turn their backs unto thee. And I will send hornets before thee, which shall drive out the Hivite, the Canaanite, and the Hittite from before thee. I will not drive them out from before thee in 1 year, lest the land become desolate and the beast of the field multiply against thee. But little and little I will drive them out from before thee, until thou be increased and inherit the land. And I will set thy bounds from the Red Sea, even unto the sea of the Philistines, and from the desert unto the river. For I will deliver the inhabitants of the land into your hand, and thou shalt drive them out before thee. Thou shalt make no covenant with them, nor with their gods. They shall not dwell in thy land, lest they make sin against me. For if thou serve their gods, it will surely be a snare unto thee. So I'll start this interpretation, and it seems to me, I would think about this psychologically, the idea here is that the proper orienting principles of the state and the psyche have now been established. And there's two injunctions. There's an injunction here and a promise. The injunction is, you bloody well better pay attention and abide by these principles. And then the promise is, if you do so, you'll be utterly unstoppable, even in war. And so, and I think, well, we can think about that practically. We know that morale, for example, is an extraordinarily important feature of what might constitute the preconditions for victory on the battlefield. And so then you might say, well, what are the preconditions for morale? And that would be something like a unity that provides for cooperation, that controls and constrains anxiety, and that produces hope. It's something like that. And then you might say the proper ethic is going to do that. So
switch it from psychology to sociology. This is one of the classic texts on Judaism being countercultural. You know, Abraham, the first word is negative, leave. Your country, your culture, your kin. Balaam later says, I see a people who live alone. And you can go right through the Old Testament and see again and again they're called to be different. Not the worship of the pagans, not the ways of life of the pagans. This is a call to a countercultural community.
Well, now, how do you square that with the fact that God is simultaneously pointing out that these poor Amorites, Hittites, Perizzites, etc., are now going to be in serious trouble?
I think we have to understand it in regards, if you want to understand it in a way that's useful, maybe is the best way to say it, useful for us. The Church Fathers, I think, offer a very good way to see this, is you can understand it in relationship to the gods, that it's not just about the people, it's about the gods. God is basically saying, it's what we were talking about before. You know, God is the transcendent God. He is the ultimate good. And these other gods, they're forces of nature, they're tribal gods, they are fragments. They're fragments of what reality is. And God is saying, if you worship me and if you follow my commandments, then those gods will flee, and I will reinstate something which is the right image of how the world should exist. And so the way the Church Fathers would talk about it would be, that's what happens inside you, right? You have all these gods, you have all these idols within you, and if you turn your attention towards God, then you will be able to chase out the gods and the passions and the desires you have in you. And interestingly enough, he says, I'm going to do it step by step. And this, I think, Christ is referring to this when he talks about evacuating all the demons and leaving the house empty. You know, it's something you have to do little by little. You can't just, even in yourself, and you know people that have tried to do that. It's like, well, I'm going to stop smoking and drinking and all this at the same time. And then you're like, yeah, watch what's going to happen. You're going to be desolate very soon. And that the transformation has to happen in an organic, progressive. I really think Christ is referring to this when he talks about this idea of getting rid of all the demons and leaving the house empty. It's something that has to be done slowly and progressively.
Okay, well, I'm going to bring our discussion to a halt at that point. That's actually a very nice end point. We're at the end of chapter 23, so we can progress to 24 tomorrow. It's exactly on the 2-hour mark, so that's a lovely conjunction of time and content. And so thank you, gentlemen. Douglas, very good to see you again. To all of you who are watching and listening on the Daily Wire Plus platform and wherever else you can access this content, thank you very much for your time and attention. To the Daily Wire Plus crew who make this possible, onward and upward, and we go to chapter 24 and episode 12 tomorrow. Thank you, gentlemen.
Thank you. So many young people don't get married, and many, even more than they, don't have children because they don't want to sacrifice their freedom and their independence and so on. But I just realized I have a new answer to all these young people, and that is, do you realize how much you're sacrificing if you don't get married and don't have children? No matter what you do, you sacrifice.
I will admit that I did not understand, actually, I think, what was going on with the tabernacle until I read Maps and Meaning.